Well, I was sharing with some of the youth at camp last week. It was a different kind of story in 1 Samuel 24. It was this conflict between David and Saul, and I compared it to them, with them, of it being more like a Marvel cinematic universe, kind of a battle scene. And that as wonderful and as intricate as our stories today are, the Bible is really full of these wonderful and intricate stories as well, just as marvelous as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This one today that we have of Abraham and Sarah casting out Hagar and Ishmael, it's one of those stories. But it's less like a major battle scene, and it's more like the backstory to a larger story. The part of the movie that retells a moment in childhood that sort of shapes characters' identity and explains the current situation and dilemma. This really is kind of what the book of Genesis does. It's a complex narrative prologue of sorts in it, and we read it like a backstory that helps us to understand what's going on today. So here in this story, in Genesis 21, we're not only given a complex moment within the life of a single family, although this is an important family, this is the family through which God's creative work and will be accomplished, of redeeming and recreating the creation for God's goodness and God's glory. But this is also the story of a nation. Abraham, remember, has Isaac, and Isaac will have Jacob, and Jacob gets his name changed to Israel. So hence, these are the stories in Genesis are to be read kind of on two levels. Not one is the familial level, and the other is on a national level. The book of Genesis is painting a political map of Israel and explaining the identities of the surrounding nations. So Israel at this time shares a border with the Moabites, the Amorites, the Edomites, the Arameans, and the Ishmaelites. All of these biblical Israel's kind of rival and competing nations are all descendants of either Abraham or his father Terah. Those other nations are not foreigners, they're not aliens, they're just distant relatives of one family. And their conflicts are to be reconciled through peace and negotiation, not violence. And I think there's something beautiful in that notion, that those of other nations are just distant relatives of the one human family. And anything but peace is violence against the family. Now, I mention all of that because we're introduced today to one of those kinfolk, Ishmael, of whom the Ishmaelites will come, the great hunters, the people of the desert, according to the Old Testament. But you probably already have heard by now that Ishmael is understood to be the ancestor of the Muslim faith. The three great Abrahamic faiths of the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all share the same Genesis, the same beginnings. They're all kinfolk to the same human family, but in this story, in Genesis 21, they part ways. And it's not a pretty scene, and it's probably our fault. And the scene in Genesis 21, to really be understood, has to begin back in Genesis 16. So back in Genesis 16, this is before the name change. We have Abram and we have Sarai. And God has promised offspring to Abram through Sarai. But a significant amount of time had passed since that promise was made, and they both began to lose hope. And so Sarai derives a plan. Side note, sometimes the right plan is to just sit tight and to wait for God's time and God's plan to develop. But Sarai says to Abraham, "Since the Lord is preventing me from having children, I give to you my Egyptian slave girl Hagar to be your wife. Have a baby with her, and then you'll have your offspring." Now, another quick interlude in the story to say a word on biblical family values. I don't think that means what people think it means. Abram and Sarai, remember, they travel through Egypt, and Abram lies to the Pharaoh to try to save his own skin and tells Pharaoh that Sarai is his sister, not his wife. Now, there may be a half-truth to that because it's quite possible that Sarai was Abram's half-sister, but I digress on that. God tells Pharaoh in a dream not to take Sarai into the Pharaoh's concubine and seals it with some illness, and Pharaoh lets Abram leave with Sarai and some spoils. And one of them may have been Sarai's maidservant, an Egyptian named Hagar. So what do we know about Hagar? Well, not a lot. But what we do know is that she's an Egyptian slave. She's a foreigner in the land of Canaan with no real control over her own identity or her own destiny. Hagar is not seen as a person, but rather as a solution to a problem, and is forced then to go with Abram in all that entails. And for the very first time, Hagar has something that her mistress does not have and cannot have: the ability to bear to Abram a child. And she does. And his name is Ishmael. So Hagar is still a pawn now into Sarai's plan, and the plan goes awry. As Hagar, the text says, looks with contempt upon Sarai. Now, have you ever been there before when someone gets mad at someone else because they gave them a look? Because they say the other gave me a look. Well, who knows if anything was meant by that look or not? Or perhaps what Hagar has done is she's assuming a little bit of Sarai's role as the primary wife. It's possible that's what she's doing. Or it could just be simple, plain old jealousy and envy on the part of Sarah, which, by the way, if we remember back in the book of Genesis, chapter 2 and 3, the first sin mentioned in the Bible is jealousy and envy between Cain and Abel. But needless to say that the drama is set. Among this family whom God has chosen, there is one man. There are two wives whom the only thing they share in common is animosity towards each other. And there's an unborn child named Ishmael, of whom Hagar loves, whom Abraham adores, and whom Sarai resents. Hagar, who can't find any support in any of this, who is still pregnant with child, she runs away. She runs from Sarai, who the text says has been dealing harshly with her. Other translations read that Sarai had oppressed Hagar. Now remember, this is also the story of the nations, because that word is the same violent word used later to describe how the Egyptians would treat the Israelites in captivity. So Hagar runs away from this oppression, still pregnant with Ishmael, and she runs off into the wilderness. This is the same place, by the way, where God will meet the Israelites in their exodus from freedom and oppression. God meets Hagar and the unborn Ishmael here, and notice that this woman who has no advocate now has an advocate in God. God gives her child the name Ishmael, which means God hears. For God hears the cries of the oppressed and the afflicted. And then God gives to Hagar a promise, and notice it is the exact same promise that God gives to Abraham. God gives to Hagar and says that of this child, God will make a great nation. For God's promises are never limited to a single people or a single place or a single nation. That God is generous with the promises that God makes. And then Hagar does something that nobody else in all of Scripture does. This powerless woman gives God a name. Now, it's kind of an unfortunate writing of this name in English because it looks like Elroy. And I can tell you right now, God's name is not Elroy. In Hebrew, it's El-Roi, and it means the God who sees, because God saw her when no one else would. God who sees, because Hagar was able to see God and live. God sends Hagar back to Abram and back to Sarai and bears for Abram his firstborn son, Ishmael. And man, if that was the end of the story, that would be cool. But this story continues. It picks up now in chapter 21. That is just the story to tell you this story. Ishmael at this time is about 16 or 17 years old, and we know from last week that God was good on God's promises, as God always is, to Abram and Sarai, and God gives to Abraham a son through Sarah who would be the chosen one. Now this is contrary to the norm, but normal for God. God always chooses the secondborn. And this son, Isaac, will be the one to whom God will choose to bear the nation of Israel. Remember, Isaac's name means laughter. For Sarah laughed in disbelief and then now laughs in great joy. Isaac is about 3 years old in this moment, and the time in which toddlers were weaned, and Abraham throws a great feast. This is a celebration feast because Isaac has just survived the most difficult of the child-rearing years. And an aged mother has successfully breastfed her baby through this important milestone in life. And she should be happy too. But just like a baby, resentment grows fast and strong. And the teenage Ishmael is now playing with this 3-year-old son, Isaac, whose name means laughter. The NRSV says that Ishmael was playing. The NIV says that he was mocking. And isn't it hard to tell the difference sometimes between playing and mocking? But whether Ishmael was laughing with or laughing at Isaac, whose name means laughter, stemming from this animosity towards Hagar, Sarah sees this as a threat to her baby's place and role in the family. And she says, "Cast out this slave woman," Sarah says. Notice that Sarah doesn't even use Hagar's name. How quickly we dehumanize people when we fail to use their name and instead identify them with their place and their role. And it's almost always inferior to us. "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for she shall not inherit what my son will inherit." And this pained Abraham. This text is ambivalent as to whether or not Abram really cared about Hagar or not. It's kind of the unfortunate part of the human story that there will always be those for whom some just don't care about. But Abraham is distraught because Ishmael is also Abraham's son. He has 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and he cannot bear to throw one of them away. And neither can God. And so God promises to take care of Ishmael and assures Abraham to go along with Sarah's plan. So now, with a little compassion, and in my view, not enough, Abraham sends out Hagar and Ishmael with a little bit of water and a little bit of food on a backpack. And surely they go out to the wilderness to die. Now, this is a long and complicated story that needs to be told, I think. And some of what I've noticed here in this ancestral story are some universal truths about the human family, and one of them has to do with pain and promise. We suffer, I think, from a great human condition that limits our thinking to think that one person's promise must equate to another person's pain. And this story tells us that our God is a God of promise. But God's promises do not have to mean that another one has to suffer in pain in order to see it through. As a matter of fact, God is generous with God's promises. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is also the God of Abraham and Ishmael. The Ishmaelites and the nearly 1 billion Muslims that live in this world today, 85% of which live outside of the Middle East. And Hagar, in a deep, deep moment of pain, in a scene that, in my head at least, always included Hagar and a small baby boy, Ishmael, this is actually Hagar and a 16 or 17-year-old young man. I have a 17-year-old young man. Hagar lays her son's body, once large and strong and growing young man, now weak and lifeless and on the verge of death. And I can't imagine that level of pain. And God arrives on the scene packed with promise. God heard the baby crying, the text says, or heard the boy crying, the text says, just as God always hears the pain and the crying of all of those who fall victim to the quarrels of families and nations. God makes, with Hagar and for Ishmael, the same promise that God makes to Abraham. The same promise to Abraham is the same promise to Hagar, that I will make of this young man a great nation. And Ishmael receives the water spring from the well springs of God's mercy and grace and grows to have 12 sons, the same number as Isaac's sons, the same number of sons that Isaac's son Jacob will have. The 12 tribes of Israel. Ishmael has 12 sons and 12 tribes. You see, where humanity sees promise and thinks that pain is the price to pay for it, God shares promise evenly and abundantly with the whole human family. Another thing that I've noticed in this story of the ancestral family is this theme of feast and famine. You see, a feast takes place in the weaning of Isaac, and because of the fear and jealousy and scarcity mentality that plagues us all as humans, one man's feast ends in another man's famine. But it is not so with God. God's desire is to seek out the outcasted and to bring promise to the disregarded and to offer water to the parched and fill with life those left for dead. The story of the human family continues on until this very day, still plagued with the pain brought in by the squabbles of human family, but will end, I believe the faith tells us, not in famine, but in feast. A feast of abundance. A feast where everyone belongs and no one is cast out. A feast of promise widely spread and evenly enjoyed. A feast of a great family reunion where the only proper place assigned to its members is that of welcome guest. And to Christ, who is our host. And until that day comes, may we be a people of promise, not pain. Of feast, not of famine. May we take notice of the Hagars of this world. As Phyllis Tribble writes, all sorts of rejected women have found their story in Hagar. Hagar is the faithful maid exploited. To the black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class. Hagar is the surrogate mother, or the resident alien without recourse, or the other woman, or the runaway youth. Hagar is the religious fleeing from affliction, the pregnant woman alone, the expelled wife, the divorced mother with child. Hagar is the shopping bag lady carrying bread and water, the homeless woman, the welfare mother, the self-effacing woman whose own identity seems to shrink in the light of others. Hagar is the woman who weeps as her children suffer. And yet, Hagar is the one who sees God, and the one whom God hears, and the one to whom God makes promise. Yes, my brothers and sisters, this is a story that needs to be told, and another who needs to be listened to. And how we treat the Hagars of this world will determine the story our ancestors tell of us. May it be a story of promise, not of pain. May it be a story of feast and not of famine. May it be a story of faith and love towards the whole human family. Amen.